Hi, I'm Claire Edwardes, and ahead of our big Incredible Floridas shows at Carriageworks on the 23rd and 24th of June, I wanted to take this opportunity to chat to the amazing and very well-read and, yes, experienced Michael Hooper, who is going to tell us a bit about specifically Incredible Floridas by Richard Meale and give us a bit of context for this amazing piece. And this is a talk that is exclusively for our subscribers and supporters. So thanks for joining us and welcome, Michael.
And thanks very much, Claire. I'm looking forward to the concert.
So when we first had a bit of a chat about Incredible Floridas, I was really blown away by the depth of your knowledge off the top of your head about this piece, but also the time of, the time that the piece was written in Australian music. And that is, of course, because you wrote a book about this topic. Now, what was that book called?
The book's called Australian Music and Modernism, and there are two chapters in it about Richard Meale. So yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about Richard Meale's music and especially about Incredible Floridas.
And you have quite a few sort of anecdotes, which I think our listeners would be really interested in hearing about in relation to Richard Meale's scores. I remember there was a story about a manuscript in Adelaide that was found, and also stuff to do with the world premiere in London. Maybe you can tell us some of those stories.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the National Library has all his papers and they're kind of incredible and rich, and there's lots of correspondence there. So if your subscribers are really dedicated and in Canberra, then they can go and have a look at some of his correspondence for themselves. But I think it's an important piece for him. So it was composed quickly in 1971 for the Fires of London. And at the time, the Fires of London was, their manager was James Murdoch, who of course was Australian and went on to be the director of the Australian Music Centre. And for a while, they'd been wanting a piece from Richard Meale. And for about 10 years, Meale had been thinking about a composition as a homage to Rimbaud. And there's lots of correspondence where he makes reference to writing this composition. And that's kind of all through the 1960s, he's talking about this. And when he does, he talks about it as this huge composition, an hour-long solo soprano, but chorus and orchestra. It's like everything. And I think in a way it was something like Boulez's Pli Salon Pli, which of course also a composition written about French literature. And so maybe there was a bit of like, I can do this too. Or maybe he just thought, yes, now is the time in history for big, grand compositions that kind of do everything. But I don't think we really know how much music he actually wrote. Certainly the sketches that survive are all for the version of Incredible Floridas that you'll be hearing Offspring play. And I was going to say it's more modest, but in a way it's totally not more modest, but it's shorter. It's half an hour. It's still a pretty big piece. It's not for orchestra and chorus and soprano. It's for a chamber group. And of course, because it was for the Fires of London, it's a Pierrot ensemble.
Pierrot plus one.
Pierrot plus one.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have a voice, though the instrumentalists get to vocalize a little bit. So there are voices there, but there's no solo soprano standing out the front. So really the composition process took place between about January 1971, and the premiere took place in London in the Queen Elizabeth Hall in June 1971. So there's 6 months between the start of composition proper and when it's first played. So this happened really very quickly. So some of the piece is really carefully planned in the way that we might think of like, a good academic composer of the mid-late 20th century. There's a bit of serial music in here, but there's only a little bit. And actually, the serial music is important, but it's kind of contained and it's partial, and then it gives way to, I think, something much more fluid, something much more immediate, something much less studied. And of course, if you're going to write a composition that is a homage to Arthur Rimbaud, then being studied is really not what you want to do. This composition, I guess, is attempting maybe to put the lessons from Rimbaud's life into music, so that there's lots of technique there, but it's not a piece that you would want to describe as like a technical masterpiece.
No, and it has a certain, each movement, so there are 6 movements.
Yeah.
And each movement has its own sort of organic flow and its own style and really discrete and unique atmosphere about it, I would say.
They're really different, right?
Yeah.
And even within each movement, like some of the movements kind of contain everything. The 5th movement, which is one of the longer, because the movements are different lengths. Some of them last only 2 minutes and some of them are more like 8 minutes. And the longer ones have got kind of everything in there. Whereas there are also sort of some surprises along. I don't want to give too much away for your subscribers who haven't heard the piece or looked through a score, but there are some moments where people might be surprised at what they hear. There are almost like references to other music, but
yeah, like jazz. Like one of my instruments is a jazz drum kit, and he doesn't even say like what. You just bring along a little jazz drum kit.
Yeah, and this is not what people who know Richard Meale know this period of Richard Meale's music as, you know, the high point of Australian modernism. It's kind of difficult, thoughtful, challenging music. But then there's maybe somewhere in there is also jazz, and that there's I guess a sense of something lurking underneath the surface. But maybe it's just the sense of something lurking underneath the surface, rather than it started with some jazz and then something was done to it to make it into something else.
That's true. What do you make of the very end of the piece, which again, I don't want to give too much away, but for me, like, it is so unbelievably beautiful and it sort of feels transcendent, like it just sort of opens up and goes into the sky. And also when we played this at Adelaide Festival a few years ago, also in the program was a more recent piece of his called Lumen, which was for the same combination. And I feel like and Lumen doesn't sound at all like modernism, you know, like it's the most tonal and beautiful kind of song almost. But the end of Incredible Floridas to me sort of is going a little bit in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And the he associates some different poems with different movements, though he also says, don't read too much into that. I could have chosen different poems, but the last one is Adieu. So that there is a farewell to at the end of this composition. There are also lots of bits of tonal music throughout. So the end of the first movement is kind of major, and it's like C major and minor at the same time. And there's a moment in the fourth movement has all these major chords in it. And again, for the people who kind of know Richard Meale's music a little bit, they might think the earlier music wasn't tonal, the later music is tonal. How do those two things go together? But here is the composition where it's always been there.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of beautiful moments and lovely major chords, but not just those moments.
Do you think it's because Voss, the opera, is more extreme in a certain direction? And so that's
I mean, obviously, like definitely things changed at the end of the 1970s, as they did for so many composers.
Yeah.
And so there's just, and not just in Australia, it was, you know, there's kind of global shift, I guess, in how much tonal music people are willing to kind of overtly have in their music.
And we're still in it.
We're still in it, which is fine. And those, some of the moments like that in Incredible Floridas to me do just, they sound like they're supposed to just be beautiful. And I mean, Floridas is about flowers. There is some sense that there is something just aesthetically lovely in here.
Yeah.
And some of it also sounds a bit like a reference to Debussy or to Messiaen, where especially the kind of parallel major chords, that's, you know, that sounds very much like Olivier Messiaen. And so there's like a history of people playing around with bits of tonal music, bits of beautiful music, but surrounded by things that aren't so beautiful as well. Yeah.
And what you spoke of the title before, I always think it's really interesting that he chose that as the title because it's literally just two words from a poem that has millions of words in it. And why do you think he chose that as the title?
Yeah, so it's a long poem. So it's from the what translates as The Drunken Boat. It was written in 1871, and of course, Incredible Florida is composed 100 years later in 1971. So maybe that would be one reason I could imagine that he might have chosen that. I mean, it's a striking phrase, and it's a phrase that other people have used for titles of books and what have you. I guess there's maybe something of the journeying, traveling kind of idea that's part of that. And look, I guess I think about Richard Meale's music and travel in two ways. First is he traveled a lot. And he went to Southeast Asia, and he went to the United States, and he traveled in Spain and in France. And
Can I
so
just ask a quick question? Was he actually at the premiere in London?
Yes.
Yeah. So was he living in the UK at that time, or
no, he was living in Adelaide,
Australia, and then he went over? Oh, he was because he was teaching in Adelaide.
Yeah. So he'd been teaching there for a couple of years, and I mean, even that, the journey from Sydney to Adelaide was a radical one. And I think Vincent Plush described it as like moving to limbo. Like because I think Richard Meale described, what did he say? Even the drunk people in Adelaide were sober. They had sober minds. Whereas he was really part of a much more adventurous, much more radical, much more sensual, I guess, world in Sydney. And that's not really a world that we know very much about. Like if we read the accounts of Richard Meale that are published, people tend not to talk about what life was like for an artist like him in Sydney, though there are some accounts that have been published that do talk about, the extent of the drug taking and of the kind of fluidity of like relationships, about the drinking. And I think if we don't understand that Richard Meale was actually really one of the central figures for that side of Sydney's culture, then we miss a connection with Arthur Rimbaud. And I know that John Stapleton, I think, is one of the people who talked about Richard Meale as the intellectual godfather of, what did he say? I made a note of it, of a group of talented, crazed young men, all gay, who like to get smashed.
Yeah.
And that's not what the program notes for one of Richard Meale's compositions is going to talk about. But I think it's actually really important to realize that there was that side, and that, or at least as far as the accounts that we can read about say, because I think it does make sense of the connection to Arthur Rimbaud as this person who lived a kind of life of artistry that wasn't constrained by technique and by draftsmanship, and that was, I think T.J. Clark described Rimbaud as modernism's exemplary life. That this is what an artistic movement looked like if you tried to live it. And I think in a way, Richard Meale is thinking, yes, maybe I too am living the kind of life of the avant-garde artist. And
which must be difficult in
alcohol
Adelaide.
And cigarettes and the whole thing. And then moving to Adelaide may well have felt like moving to limbo. I don't know.
Because also being gay in Adelaide at that time must have been difficult.
I don't know. That's beyond my research, but it's a kind of interesting, it's an interesting question of that kind of artistic character in that place. And one of the other artists who I was talking to about when we last spoke was Brett Whiteley, because I think of when I think of Arthur Rimbaud and Australian art and 1970, I think of Brett Whiteley, who was also painting all these portraits of Rimbaud at just the same time. And of course, we absolutely associate Brett Whiteley with his what will we say, with the kind of lifestyle choices. And that's, if we go along and we have a look at some of his pictures, then, absolutely the kind of freedom that an artist could have at this point is like, it's there in the materials, absolutely in front of us. And I think maybe sometimes we think of music as being a bit more conservative or a bit more, a bit less immediate, a bit less out there maybe. But actually, I think this composition, in the way that it does include so much, maybe a little bit, I mean, I don't want to say it's the same as Brett Whiteley, but it's kind of interesting to think about the
like
comparison.
a sonic version in a way.
Some kind of way.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
I was looking up the Brett Whiteley Rimbaud portraits again today. And, you know, one of the descriptions of like what it's made of was oil, gold leaf, synthetic polymer paint, mummified lacquered cat's head, and collage on 6 wooden panels. And there is something of like the breadth of that kind of finds its way into bits of Richard Meale, so that we have tonal chords and serialism and a jazz kit and these kind of incredibly beautiful moments and, you know, little repetitive kind of patterns that keep playing out.
Yeah. And violin playing viola, which doesn't doesn't happen very often.
No, and of course the wind players have to be playing multiphonics, and there's that kind of exploration of media that was going on as well.
And I guess my last question would just be around, do you think he was celebrated enough in Australia during his life and kind of appreciated for the composer that I think, well, Ensemble Offspring at least is trying to kind of remind the world, remind Australia at least, like, this composer was a really important composer, and we don't just have Peter Sculthorpe to remember, you know, there's Richard Meale and there's others, and we can't forget these people.
I mean, I think that's always a good question to ask. And, you know, we could ask that of so many different artists.
Yeah.
But I think it's so if we think about the 1960s and 1970s, we probably still think about Peter Sculthorpe. He was absolutely one of the important composers of that time. If we think about 10 or 20 years later, we're probably still thinking about Peter Sculthorpe in a way that Richard Meale, I don't want to say fell from center, because we have Voss and these, you know, amazing big opera commissions, you know, that show the recognition that he received. But I think there was definitely a moment in the early 1970s, right around the composition of Incredible Floridas, where Richard Meale was absolutely vital to musicians in Australia. And I think it was partly because he was, certainly when he lived in Sydney, introducing so much new music into the Sydney, to Sydney audiences. And part of that was through the ISCM network. There were just a series of ISCM concerts, and Peter Sculthorpe.
What does ISCM stand for again?
The International Society for Contemporary Music.
Yeah.
And so Peter Sculthorpe and Nigel Butterley and many others were a very important part of that. And you know, there is a kind of, I don't know whether was a friendly rivalry or a not friendly rivalry, or a kind of made up rivalry for publicity reasons, but there's definitely something to the, you know, Peter Sculthorpe and Richard Meale being very different artists, and a kind of tension between the two. Yeah. And Richard Meale, in what he wrote to publicize Incredible Floridas in the Listener, in the magazine The Listener, is talking about what it means to be an Australian composer. And he basically says it's just not important, that he's a composer of the world, he's a cosmopolitan, he's not interested in making music that is, you know, distinctively Australian, or you know, he says he opposes the formation of an Australian school of music. And I think it's very hard not to read that as some kind of criticism of Peter Sculthorpe and what he was trying to do in forming a distinctively Australian voice.
Yeah.
The ISCM festival, so Richard Meale had been involved with ISCM's Sydney branch, and then the commission for Incredible Floridas was for an ISCM festival in London, so a bigger festival. And of course, this is an international festival. The program has a program note in English, and it's translated into French, like as this like ancient diplomatic language, you know, that we all speak fluently. So I think it is a composition that we might understand in the Australian context, but it's also by a composer who's saying we don't have to understand it like that. We can understand it as music for the world, that everyone it kind of has an equal right to it. It doesn't have to be attached to Australian ideas if we don't want it to be. And at the same time, there is something that, you know, he's writing about it as in terms of Australian music. And even though he's sort of rejecting the idea of Australian music, he's still writing about it in those terms. So it's still part of our idea of what it means to be writing Australian music, you know, certainly at that time.
Yeah, interesting. Wow, so good to chat to you about all of this stuff. And I could do it over a beer next time, maybe, and we could talk about even more stuff. We won't record that one.
Okay, sounds very good. But I'm just so looking forward to the concert, and I think it really is important to revisit some of these, you know, early pieces or music from 50 years ago, and to see how they sound again, and to remember, you know, the treasures that we have.
Absolutely. Hear, hear. And thanks, Michael, and I'll see you soon.
Great. Thanks. See you. Bye.